Thank you everybody for joining me here. I'm Matt Johnson from Marathon of History, and today we have something we've not done before. I have a co-host, and I'd like to introduce Stephanie McMullen from Grey Roots Museum and Archives. Stephanie is the community historian in Grey Roots and contributed to Marathon of History magazine. So thank you for coming, Stephanie.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, and we have somebody who needs no introduction to the World War II fans in Canada. We have Mark Zuehlke. Mark, 14 books on World War II
Yeah.
and counting.
And counting, yes.
And you have a War of 1812 book too, don't you?
Yes, and one on World War One called Brave Battalion, which followed the Canadian Scottish Regiment, 16th
Oh,
Battalion,
okay.
through World War One. Another one called The Gallant Cause on Canadians in the Spanish Civil War. My my first military history book.
So Mark's here today to talk to us about tanks, and everybody loves tanks. I know as a kid I had many models, spent all my money on tank models. So Mark, when we talk about tanks, we think back to the First World War, 1916, things weren't going well. Uh, Tanks were sort of a new technology. Then
hmm
what happened to Canada from that point, till World War II? What happened to our armored forces sort of in that time period?
It's a long, sad story. So we finished World War One. Everyone came out of World War One with an appreciation that tanks were a bit of a battlefield changer. Very dramatic. The last 100 days, we see the tanks playing a huge role in moving offensive actions forward. War comes to an end. Everyone comes home. It's the Great War, the war to end all wars, et cetera, et cetera. And our Canadian government kind of took that almost literally. And you see very little investment into armored core development. Everyone appreciates and understands that the next war, if there's going to be a war, that there's going to be tanks and that
Right.
they're going to play an essential role. But in what is a typical story that we've seen over and over and over again in Canada, um, you have a government that does not want to invest in tanks because they're expensive and they remain expensive today, and nobody wants to invest in them. And so, you have basically when World War II comes around, we don't have any tanks. Zip. We have a small armored corps that has been struggling to try and understand and learn tank tactics in the absence of actually having tanks. At various points, they're even using, the horses and wagons to sort of simulate tanks and going around. And they get a few trainer tanks for old World War One, ones that they bought from the United States that they use a little bit, but they have nothing that's going to put them in the field when the war comes. And what they do have, we have quite a solid cavalry corps, well equipped, well organized, and ready to fight the war that was never going to be fought again. Because the day of cavalry was gone. Yet here we are, we're nurturing that, and actually envisioning some role for them. And there is no role. So that's kind of where it was at in 1939, and then everyone says, "Whoops, we got to scramble." Um, there weren't many people, like the actual personnel. So there was a group of officers who had been struggling with this whole thing of, well, what's armor going to look like in a Canadian Army context in a war. 1939 comes, they realize they've got to get serious. 1940 comes, especially this summer of 1940, May 1940, when the Germans blitzkrieg through France and Holland and Belgium. Uh, Suddenly, everyone's seeing what tanks can do. They saw it to some degree in Poland, but really, actually, the Germans didn't have although they blitzkrieged through Poland, the tanks they were utilizing were pretty poor, Mark IIs and things like that, largely. Some of them with 20 millimeter guns and things like that. So they were a game changer, but by the time they go into France, they're up to, tanks that have 75 millimeter capability. So a very, everyone's realizing that particularly in Canada, we're going to have to play a major game of catch up. Um, and so that's sort of the status that we're in as we move forward.
So, like you say, it was a game of catch up. And how much would obviously officers watch other armies, and they would have been watching the German army pretty close. In between the wars, did they have an idea that Germany was gathering this tank force and had these tactics, or was this kind of a well-kept secret?
Everyone knew that they were working. The Germans were really developing their tank corps. France was too. France's performance in the May 1940 actually came as quite a surprise to everyone, because France had been perceived as being actually the leader in the tank competition, if you will have it, with rearmament. The French were desperately trying to rearmor from 1939 through to the 1940s, trying to build up their armies and get everything together. And things looked pretty promising, but of course they hinged everything on the Maginot Line, and then the Germans didn't play along with that. They came through the Ardennes again.
Right.
That's always the problem. We make a plan, and then well, these guys aren't cooperating. Nobody really knew what the German tank strategies were. And nobody outside of Germany was, I think, as forward thinking as people like Guderian and that in Germany, who, were really developing the Blitzkrieg tactic. Tanks, in World War I, tanks were support to the infantry. And the doctrine that had developed, particularly in Canada, was that the tank was not being they were sort of being perceived as cavalry, but not fully. In a way, they were perceived more as a support to infantry, which in the end is sort of more or less how we end up using tanks in World War II, partly due to geography and partly due to our own organization. So yeah, there's the idea that tanks could operate independently, was not as conceived as the Germans had it. And the Germans were really relying on it, because what they didn't do in May and out of 1940 and really throughout most of World War II is they weren't as heavily mechanized as we would become. Their dependence on horse-drawn wagons for the infantry remains throughout the war. That's the main way they move supplies and move people and move equipment. They create small mechanized, working on the half tracks that you see in the films. They've got those as small units, but it's not the main body of the army. So those could keep up with the tanks in theory and provide them with some protection. But that was really, so it's very much, the Germans have the idea that the tanks are the tip of a big arrow that's going
Right.
forward.
Right.
And behind that is this great mass of kind of slow moving infantry. And we see that when the German armor gets down around Dunkirk in May, that they kind of run out of steam. They actually run out of fuel
Right.
to a large extent, and because the fuel is being brought forward by horses and wagons, and so you get that kind of problem happening. So there's an Achilles heel that's there in the German organization, but it's not recognized for a long time. Everyone was stunned by the rapidity of the offensive into France, Belgium, and Holland. And the speed at which the French government collapses. So then we have Britain alone and all that kind of, standing alone, except for the support of the Commonwealth countries, and particularly Canada, who's providing the supply lifeline. And so what's this mean for tanks? Well, we don't have one. So if we start trying to develop one, that leads to manufacture of the Valentine, although that's a British initiative that is just carried out in Canada to a large extent because we have factories that aren't being bombed. And we move to the Ram tank, which is the Canadian design tank. The Ram doesn't have a huge armor. The gun is originally a 2-pounder, which is not much of a gun. Then they sort of start moving to a 6-pounder. The design changes a little bit, so it's not as vulnerable. The original design, they have this weird evacuation escape hatch built into the side of the turret, which is very vulnerable to any kind of anti-tank gun fire. So they realize that, and they fix that, and things get fixed. And the Ram was not a particularly bad tank, but it's, by the time we get over to Armored Corps goes, mostly they moved over to the UK in 1941-42, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the other infantry divisions were sent earlier. So they get over there. They're starting to train and work in that European landscape, and the Ram is showing problems. There's also, do we want to have a completely different tank than the British have? Does this make any kind of sense? So you start to see the evolution of our movement towards adopting the Churchill initially. So the Churchill comes along, and the Churchill is a reasonably decent tank. It's going to stay in service right through World War II in the British and some Commonwealth units. We abandoned it after Dieppe. Both the Churchill 2 and the Churchill 3 were equipped to the Calgary Regiment for the Dieppe raid. The Churchill 2 had a 2-pounder gun. Churchill 3 has a 6-pounder gun. It's in the improvement. So they're both there at Dieppe. And the Canadians had been starting to see some problems with the Churchills. It's a slow tank. It's not nimble at all. It's got a good punch in its 6-pounder gun. And the British used them very effectively through the course of the war. Not on all of their regiments. They also had Shermans as well. But as we're getting ready to go to Sicily, we start the transition into the Sherman tank, and that's what will end up being taken to Sicily.
This episode of the Marathon of History podcast is brought to you by Grey Roots Museum and Archives. Grey Roots, located 5 minutes south of Owen Sound, boasts a fantastic array of exhibits and special events this summer. Bring the whole family to check out Morriston Heritage Village, Grey Roots' collection of historical buildings. History comes alive at Grey Roots Museum and Archives. Plan your visit today at greyroots.com.
Stephanie actually, she wrote an article about a local Canadian Forces training base that, what year is it founded? I forget.
Yeah, it was selected in July 1942.
Okay.
And interestingly, and the question that still remains for me is that in the central area, there wasn't any approved training grounds that could really support the weight of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. And so that was one of the reasons that the Meaford base was chosen. But what is the difference between an armored fighting vehicle and a tank?
They're basically armored fighting vehicle encompasses a larger entity, I guess you could say, or category. So we didn't really have armored fighting vehicles besides the tanks. Oh no, that's actually not true. Because armored cars, for example, with wheels, are an armored fighting vehicle. As you move forward into the 1950s, 60s, and onward into these, we have lots of different, the Coyote, for example, was an armored fighting vehicle. It's not a tank. So it's not the difference of designation. They're designed for light operations. They're lightly armored. They're nimble. They still weigh a heck of a lot. And that's why your training bases needed. All of these things are really heavy. I'm imagining the selection of that area. Is it quite? Was it fairly open at that time?
Yeah, they selected it because there is a wide open plain in the center of the area that became the training base that was very solidly packed. The soil was not great for farming, but perfectly suited to have tanks run across it. And then it also has considerable coastline along Georgian Bay that really made it an ideal place for training for the Normandy invasion. So it had lots to recommend to it.
Yeah, lots of potential.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, with the Normandy invasion, we're getting into amphibious tanks and things like that. So, I don't know if they actually developed a duplex drive tank in Canada for training purposes, or if that was just done in Normandy or in the UK. That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There's
Future podcast episode.
yeah, like what was the preparations there?
Yeah.
So yes, that makes sense, and also it makes sense too because you don't want to have to take everybody that you're training to operate tanks and have to shift them all the way out to the prairies, or wherever to do the training. So they trained up mostly the Western Canadian people at bases in the prairies. So by the time we're ready to go to Sicily, the doctrine and the organization of armored regiments has really come together. And so the 1st Canadian Army Tank Battalion was what went to Sicily. They then are renamed the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade towards the end of that campaign. And there's the organization, and this is the organization that independent squadrons or regiments of brigades, I should say, will have, is that there are 3 regiments to each brigade, and within those you have a brigade has three squadrons in the form that's created for the invasion of Sicily. And that's the structure that the Canadians in Italy will keep. What'll happen when we go into Normandy is the regiments get expanded a little bit. They've got a little more teeth to them. But the ones that went into Italy, that's what you're looking at is 3 squadrons. And each of those has like 3 troops within them, and they have 3 tanks in each troop. and that's the kind of way it's structured. And that fits into the tactics that they were using, because they when you could actually operate as a tank squadron is supposed to be operating, which was rare in Italy because of the ground just being so too rugged, and you don't have nice big areas to deploy. You would deploy your troop in a three tank arrow, and the troop commander would be at the tip of the thing, and then the two other guys tanks on the outside. And so it's kind of, that's the format of how they operated. And they, even when they got the chance to do so, that's the way the whole squadron would be deployed, with one troop in the lead, one over here and one over there. Doesn't happen very often in Italy because of the grounds, they just never got that kind of nice big wide open country. And so tanks, we see in Sicily a realization that there's not a lot that tanks can do for the operations. So they only deploy one regiment of tanks in support of 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and that's the Three Rivers Regiment. And it serves primarily as close range artillery, being brought up. They do lead a couple pushes into Garicamale. And so occasionally they're out in the front, but not very often. Grammakelly, that's the name of the place.
But these are all places we can probably check out on your tour in the fall, right? You're going back
Yes.
to get a little plug in here for Liberation Tours while we're
Yeah, we actually do a briefing on that fight right in the square at Grammakelly. It's the first time the Canadians slammed into the Germans in a big way.
Oh, okay.
In Sicily, because the Germans didn't know where the invasion was going to come, so the Italians were put all around the island at the logical places that you could land, which was all over the place.
Right.
It would work. Anywhere on that southeast coast is going to work for an invasion. So they had Italians concentrated down there, and then the Germans were up in the mountains to the west of Etna, the big volcano. And with the idea that when the invasion came, they would scurry out there and meet the invasion on the beaches, but it all happened so quickly they weren't able to do that. So they actually start fighting. They then just sat back and waited. In our case, for us to get there. On the British side, they were able to interdict the British advance from Syracuse towards Catania and hold them. And then that's when 1st Canadian Infantry Division is then given the job of outflanking that and freeing up, drawing the Germans away so the British could push through. Okay. And that's really the grand strategy that is running everything with 1st Canadian Infantry Division operations in Operation Husky. So we're using tanks primarily as a kind of mobile artillery. And it works well, plays a big role. And then the other two regiments, the Calgary tanks and the Ontario tanks, come in towards the end of the campaign and support British operations on the other side. And the last Canadian to die in Sicily was actually a Canadian tanker with the Ontario regiment, I believe. And so there's the structure. We've kind of proven that we know how to operate tanks on a fairly limited scale, but we've done it. And we've got the experience of Dieppe, where the tanks, although confined to the beach and the esplanade, had shown that their firepower plays a major part, particularly in the evacuation from the beach. It's the ability of the Calgary tankers lay down covering fire that allows a lot of the infantry to manage to get off the beach. So, there's a definite appreciation for what tanks can do and an understanding of that. And when we move over to Italy's and the mainland Italy, same thing. We bring those regiments along. So the armored regiments, armored brigades, their role is to support the infantry division. And we have another entity which arrives after the Battle of Ortona, and in that winter, before we go into the Leary Valley operations by Monte Cassino, which is 5th Canadian Armored Division. And they're a different cat entirely than the armored brigades, because armored brigades are to support infantry divisions. 5th Armored Divisions, the tanks are the core of the thing, and they're perceived as the lead in that operation. They're not supporting, they're the lead player. And they have an infantry brigade attached to them that's inherent in the division. Their role is to support the tanks. So it's a different conception of how things are going to work.
So just a question, just before we move into Italy, Mark. When the British are fighting, 8th Army's fighting in Africa, they're the tanks in the desert. Did we have any observers with them? Or obviously we were watching that closely. Now, would there have been a lot of lessons they could have taken from North Africa to Sicily, or was Sicily a whole new ball game as far as like
they lessons that we learned in Africa actually turn out to be a handicap when we get into Italy, and that was the handicap is that large scale armored operations were possible in North Africa. And so the British and the Canadians and the Australians and everybody are studying this and learning from it. And we did have observers in Africa. We also had attached officers from the infantry, armor, artillery, who got attached to different units in Africa with the idea of learning and getting some combat experience. Because at this point we don't have a lot, so we're trying to get a small core of people who actually had been in the fighting, had been in some fighting before we go into Sicily in particular. Although at that point nobody's anticipating that Canada is going to go to Sicily. That's a different story for later. That's a whole political little diorama. And so, like, for example, I was very good friends with retired Colonel Strom Galloway of the Royal Canadian Regiment and he was one of those officers who was sent to get experience, and he served with the Irish Regiment in Africa for he was there for about 5 months. And so quite a few of these guys, and so they were getting experience, and when they get to Sicily, although they're not commanding, they're people within a regiment who actually have been in battle and understand a bit more, the way the Germans fight, that sort of thing. So yeah, we had definitely some experience. Sicily is a totally different operation because it's just so incredibly rugged. It's not even there's no semblance of tank country in Sicily. And we get over to Italy and we find, well, they ain't much different. It's the same kind of rugged country. There's always another river coming out of the Apennines cutting across your path that the engineers then have to bridge, and you have to get across that. And the Germans have also learned that they can sit on the other side of that river and make your life miserable until you force a crossing.
If only there was a book about the river battles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the whole Italian campaign in a way is a river battle, although it gets even more intense when we get up in the north where the river battles book was placed.
Well, history fans, that's all the time we have for this week on Marathon of History Television. But be sure to tune in next episode when Mark Zuehlke joins us again for the second part of Canadian tanks in the Second World War. Again, thank you very much for watching. My name is Matt Johnson. We'll see you next time.